They came in silence. The trucks rolled through the pine forests of Louisiana, their engines growling softly against the stillness of a winter afternoon. Inside, huddled together beneath coarse army blankets, sat dozens of German women prisoners, nurses, auxiliaries, and clerks once bound to the crumbling Reich. The war in Europe was ending, though none of them knew how to name that ending. It was not peace yet. It was an echo, a sound that trembled through their bones, carrying shame, exhaustion, and fear. When the vehicles turned past the wooden gate marked Camp Ruston, some of the women dared to lift their heads. Ahead lay rows of low wooden barracks surrounded by fences of barbed wire that glinted under the pale sun. The air smelled of pine sap and damp soil, clean, almost gentle. But to them, it smelled of captivity. To be behind wire was to be forgotten, to be punished for things they did not understand or things they had obeyed. A U.S. Army sergeant motioned for them to step down. Boots met gravel. The sound was sharp, rhythmic, final. The women's uniforms hung loosely on their thin frames. They had crossed the Atlantic in the hold of a Liberty ship, seasick and terrified, imagining chains, interrogations, or worse. For weeks, rumors had traveled among them. The Americans humiliate women. They make you scrub latrines, they cut your hair, they laugh at your shame. So when the first order came, undress, all of you. Leave your clothes in a pile. The fear turned to panic. No one spoke, but their eyes said everything. A tall blonde woman in the second row crossed her arms tightly. Another, once a typist from Hamburg, began to shake so violently that a guard stepped forward, concerned. The translator repeated the command in German. The words, though calm, struck like a whip. Undress, one woman whispered to another. They'll photograph us. They'll parade us. Her lips quivered. The youngest of them, barely 19, bit her tongue to keep from crying. The humiliation they had been warned of, the stripping of dignity, had come. But then something unexpected happened. The soldiers didn't shout. They didn't leer. Instead, they opened a wooden shed nearby and carried out white towels, bars of soap, and clean uniforms folded neatly on a bench. The translator's voice softened. You will shower. Hot water. You need to be clean. For a long moment, no one moved. The air held its breath. Then the first woman, the same one who had trembled uncontrollably, stepped forward. Her hands were stiff as she undressed, her eyes hollow, bracing for mockery that never came. A female Red Cross worker guided her toward the bathhouse. Steam curled from the open door. Inside, the noise of running water filled the tiled room, a sound alien and tender all at once. One by one, the women entered. The first touch of heat on their skin was unbearable. It burned, not from temperature, but from disbelief. Some gasped aloud. Others began to sob quietly, their shoulders shaking as the grime of months of war, of escape, of fear slid away down the drain. Outside, an American nurse waited with clean towels. She did not speak German, but when she saw their faces, she smiled. Small, uncertain, but genuine. One woman whispered, "Warum?" Why? The nurse only handed her a towel and said softly, "Because you need it." That night in the barracks, the women lay wrapped in wool blankets on narrow cots. Their hair was damp, their skin raw but clean. The warmth of the shower clung to them, impossible to forget. The same camp that had once terrified them now smelled faintly of soap and pine. They were prisoners, yes, but something invisible had shifted. For the first time since capture, silence no longer felt like fear, it felt like rest. In the dark, one of them, a woman named Elfrida Bauer, who had been a schoolteacher before the war, reached for a piece of paper she had kept hidden inside her boot. Her hand trembled as she wrote, "They told us to take off our clothes. I thought they would destroy us. But they gave us soap and warm water. I never felt so human again." She folded the note and placed it beneath her pillow. The moon rose over Camp Ruston, silvering the barbed wire. Beyond the fences, the forest whispered softly. The world they had known, of commands, salutes, and fear, was gone. In its place was something quieter, harder to name. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the beginning of understanding that even in defeat, there could still be dignity. The guards on night duty smoked silently by the gate. They did not know what their kindness had done, or how that simple act, a hot bath, soap, and clean towels, had pierced through years of indoctrination. For the women inside, the war had not just ended by surrender. It had ended by warmth. The wind carried the smell of pine and steam. And somewhere, faintly, a woman began to hum a lullaby, a song she had not dared to sing since her children were taken to the shelters during air raids. In the hush of the Louisiana night, her voice trembled, cracked, and found its way back to life. Morning came with a gentler light. A heavy fog clung to the treetops around Camp Ruston, as if the forest itself wished to muffle the memory of war. Inside the women's barracks, the damp smell of wool and wet hair lingered. But so did something rarer in this place. The scent of soap, not the harsh, stinging kind used to scrub floors. This soap was soft, nearly floral. A sliver remained tucked into a wooden slat between bunk beds. One woman had kept it there, like a talisman. She had buried her brother after a Soviet artillery shell shredded their village. She had marched behind trucks through frozen Hungarian fields. But she had never, until yesterday, been offered a towel by someone she considered an enemy. Now, she held that soap and breathed it like memory. The guards outside began their patrols. Orders were still barked. The wire still stood. But among the German women prisoners, something unseen had begun to shift. Not just externally, but within. Their certainty, once absolute, had started to fray. The Reich had told them America was corrupt, brutal, primitive. That American soldiers defiled women and humiliated prisoners. That those captured could expect only cruelty. It was whispered and shouted, carved into every training lecture, every propaganda reel. To surrender was to forfeit dignity. But yesterday, someone had given them towels. No photos were taken, no mocking words exchanged, just hot water, clean hands, and silence. It wasn't how they imagined defeat. In one corner of the barracks, Annalisa Köhler, a 26-year-old former Red Cross assistant, stared at her reflection in a tin shaving mirror stolen from a latrine wall. She hadn't seen her face clearly in weeks, perhaps months. Now, her cheekbones were sharp, her eyes sunken but alert. She rubbed a damp towel slowly along her throat, pausing where the collar of her uniform used to press. "I don't look like the enemy," she whispered. No one answered, but others were listening. They were all beginning to notice the strange, jarring contrast between expectation and reality. Later that morning, an American lieutenant entered with a translator. The women froze, as if bracing for inspection. The translator read a list of names. They were to be assigned duties within the camp. Laundry, kitchen prep, groundskeeping. Nothing unusual. But then the officer added something else. After duty hours, you are allowed to walk the inner grounds. A sewing room will be opened. There is no forced labor here. The women looked at one another, confused. The older ones exchanged glances, trying to read between the lines. Was this mercy or manipulation? Elfriede Bauer, the former schoolteacher, quietly replied in German, "They want something. They wouldn't do this for free." Another woman answered, "Maybe they don't need to punish us. Maybe winning is enough for them." That sentence lingered in the air. Maybe winning was enough. It was the first time any of them had said it aloud. That they were truly the defeated. Not captured, not trapped, but undeniably on the wrong side of history. And with that acknowledgement came something they hadn't yet faced. Shame. In the laundry building, steam hissed from iron pipes. Women stirred boiling vats of uniforms, the scent of bleach stinging their noses. They worked alongside African-American civilians hired by the camp, a fact that startled many of them. In Germany, under Hitler, such contact would have been forbidden. Now, in silence, they handed shirts to men who returned the favor with a nod. Not a smirk, not a sneer, just acknowledgement. One dark-skinned worker offered a fresh bar of soap to a German woman whose hands were cracked and bleeding. She hesitated, then took it. Their fingers brushed. No words. But everything changed in that moment. Outside, a crow called from a pine bough. The women hung sheets on lines, watching them ripple like surrender flags. At lunch, they received rations. Meatloaf, potatoes, and a strange red sauce they learned was ketchup. Some refused it out of pride. Others devoured it out of hunger. But one woman, after tasting a soft biscuit, covered her mouth and wept. It reminded her of something. Not Germany, but of what safety had once felt like before the world burned. By nightfall, a few dared to hum again. A lullaby, a hymn. Nothing bold. But sound returned to them, and with it, the painful joy of being seen, not stripped, not punished. In her cot, Annalisa stared at the ceiling and murmured, "How can this be war?" And Elfriede answered softly from across the room, "It's not war anymore. It's what comes after." The lights dimmed, the heater hissed. And outside the barracks, the wind shifted gently through the pines, as if listening. They had not yet forgiven, nor could they. But they had been touched by something that demanded no ideology to understand. The heat of water, the softness of a towel, the weightlessness of not being hated. And in that, something greater than survival began to stir. Days passed. The rhythm of captivity settled into something almost bearable. The clang of the morning bell, the smell of coffee from the American mess hall, the shuffle of boots on gravel as guards changed posts. Camp Ruston began to feel less like a prison and more like a waiting room between two worlds. The one they had lost and the one they did not yet understand. Yet beneath the calm surface, beliefs were cracking, slow and painful, like thawing ice. Many of the women had once believed, with the certainty of faith, that Germany's cause was righteous, that obedience was virtue, and that their sacrifices had meaning. They had been told the Americans were beasts in uniform, invaders who would desecrate what was pure, who had no culture, no soul. And now, here they were, being given soap, bread, and space to rest. The contradiction tore quietly at the mind. In the barracks, at night, they spoke in whispers, as if afraid the walls themselves might judge them. "I dreamed of my mother," one woman said. "She was washing clothes in the river. When I tried to help her, the water turned to blood." Another answered, "I dreamed of a train. But this time, it wasn't leaving. It was coming back." These were not the dreams of victors, nor of villains. They were the dreams of people awakening. People realizing they had built their world on something that was no longer there. One morning, the women were marched to the camp infirmary for health checks. American nurses examined them with quiet efficiency. Pulse, temperature, weight. No cruelty, no gloating. The nurses' faces were tired, impersonal, yet kind in the smallest gestures. The way they adjusted a sleeve or offered a cup of water. Annalisa watched one nurse bandage a German woman's blistered hands. The nurse said, "You should rest them for a day." The translator added softly, "She says you should not work tomorrow." The woman blinked, stunned. In her old life, compassion had been a luxury. Here, it was routine. As they left the infirmary, Elfrida, the schoolteacher, stopped to look at a large poster pinned to the wall. It showed a map of Europe, bright with colored borders. At the bottom, in neat letters, were the words, "The United Nations, working for peace." For a long moment, she studied it, her mind racing. Germany was still on that map, but smaller now, split by the occupation zones she'd only heard rumors of. The Reich she had been told would last 1,000 years had lasted 12. That night, she wrote in her notebook, "They show us maps where our country is a ghost, yet the people who defeated us treat us like living things. I don't understand how mercy survives victory." Outside, crickets sang through the dark. A week later, the women were assigned new tasks: sorting Red Cross parcels, mending uniforms, and translating captured documents. They were trusted with scissors, with ink, with access to books, even English primers. This trust frightened them more than punishment ever had. One evening, the American chaplain visited the camp. He was tall, his face weathered by sun and loss. He spoke through an interpreter, not of politics, but of washing away war, of how every human heart carries dirt, and every hand must learn again how to cleanse without hate. He said, "When water runs over a wound, it stings, but that's how it heals." The words struck something deep. For these women, the act of washing had already become symbolic, a ritual of rebirth. That first bath, that first touch of hot water, had peeled away more than grime. It had peeled away illusion. Annalisa lay awake that night, the chaplain's words echoing inside her. When water runs over a wound, it stings. She realized she had begun to feel again, and that feeling hurt. For years, emotion had been swallowed, hidden behind uniforms, behind orders. But now, with clean skin and quiet nights, the past began to crawl back through the cracks. Faces, villages, the sound of bombs, the smell of burning. Things she had buried to stay sane. One afternoon, as she scrubbed dishes in the camp kitchen, she caught sight of her reflection in a pot. And behind her, the smiling face of an American soldier. Not cruel, not leering, just a young man, maybe 20, wiping sweat from his brow. The enemy, but not the monster she'd imagined. She felt a tremor of confusion, almost guilt, for seeing him as human. Later, while hanging laundry, she said to Elfrida, "I think we were afraid of shadows. We were told they were giants, but they were only men." Elfrida nodded, and we became the shadows. The two women stood in silence, surrounded by the scent of soap and wet fabric, the wind moving gently through the sheets. Above them, a formation of birds crossed the pale sky, migrating north, back toward a homeland that no longer existed in the way they remembered. There, in the quiet heart of Louisiana, far from the ruins of Europe, they began to understand something profound. Defeat could be a teacher, if one listened. The camp gates no longer looked like the bars of a cage. They looked like a boundary between what had been and what could still be rebuilt. Not nations, not empires, but souls. And that night, as the guards dimmed the floodlights, the scent of soap still hung in the air. faint, persistent, pure, like the ghost of forgiveness that refused to fade. It was in the mess hall, oddly enough, that ideology met its quietest death. Rows of German women sat at long wooden tables, the air thick with the smell of boiled vegetables, yeast bread, and hot coffee. Trays were slid down the line, a scoop of mashed potatoes, a slice of meatloaf, a square of cornbread they didn't recognize. At the end came something entirely alien, a small cup of something red, sweet, cold, thick. "Was this das?" one of them asked. A young American private shrugged. "Ketchup." The women exchanged glances. They had seen ration books filled with powdered milk and turnips. They had tasted bitterness at every checkpoint from Berlin to Cherbourg. But this strange sugary sauce and soft bread, this was enemy food. At first, they picked at it cautiously, suspicious of the taste. Some refused to eat. Others tried and gagged, unused to the sweetness. But hunger softens pride. And by the second week, most of them ate everything they were given. What surprised them more than the food was how routine the act became. Not punishment, not rations flung through wire, but meals served by cooks who sometimes smiled, sometimes didn't, but never sneered. "Sie geben uns zu essen wie Menschen." They feed us like humans. It was said softly, almost with embarrassment, as if admitting such a thing might undo the last 10 years of national pride. Elfriede Bauer began to sit with the same small group each day. Anneliese, Marta, a quiet woman named Ilse who never spoke unless asked. They did not call themselves friends. That word still felt too fragile. But they sat in a row, facing the same direction, sharing glances when something on the tray changed. One morning, they were given peanut butter. Thick, salty, strange. Ilse grimaced. Marta spat hers out with a curse. But Anneliese took a second bite, then a third. "I don't like it," she said. "But I think I will someday." The others laughed. A quiet, careful laugh. Not bold, not the kind from before the war, but the laughter of people who were learning how to exist again. Later that week, one of the American guards, a black soldier with a Louisiana drawl, noticed a few of the women lingering by the mess line after everyone had eaten. He raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Instead, the next day, extra slices of cornbread appeared on their trays. It was a small gesture, but it did not go unnoticed. These were the same women who had been taught that men like him were beneath them. Inferior. Unclean. But he had offered kindness without expectation, and it shook something deep in their foundations. Elfriede turned to Anneliese that night and whispered, "What if it was all lies?" Anneliese stared at the ceiling, her voice low. "Then who are we?" Silence followed, not because they had no answer, but because they knew the answer would cost them something. The bread they ate each night was becoming a mirror. Every bite was a contradiction. They had been told Americans were decadent, yet they fed their enemies. They had been told defeat meant humiliation, yet here they sat with warm food in their bellies. One evening, a Red Cross volunteer entered the mess hall with a stack of books. English readers, simple grammar guides, even a few German language novels translated from American authors. The women stared. Books had not been forbidden during their indoctrination, but they had been filtered, weaponized. Every word passed through a nationalist lens. Now they were invited to read without filters. Ilse picked up a book of poems and held it like a fragile egg. Marta found a dog-eared copy of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and smirked. "An American boy?" she said. "Let's see how much trouble he causes." Elfriede selected Leaves of Grass, not knowing the name Walt Whitman, but drawn to its weight. That night, in the barracks, She read slowly by candlelight. I do not ask the wounded person how he feels. I myself become the wounded person. The words struck her with a force no sermon ever had. She closed the book, pressed it to her chest, and exhaled. The next day, she gave the book to Annalise. "There's something in here," she said. "Something. I don't know what to call it. But it knows us." Annalisa took it wordlessly. She did not read it right away. But she held it close, as if it were a letter from someone who remembered who they might have been. Each evening now, the bread was broken in silence. But it was no longer just food. It was a ritual of survival and unmaking, of learning to taste without prejudice, to nourish without judgment. And slowly, one soft American slice at a time, the scaffolding of hate began to fall away. Not through argument, not through force, but through food, through warmth, through the ache of being treated with care, and the unbearable fact that they did not know how to return it. The enemy's bread had become their mirror. And in that mirror, the truth began to shimmer. Terrible, liberating, and real. There were no radios in the barracks, no newspapers, only whispers. The war, they heard, was over, or nearly over. Berlin had fallen. Hitler was dead. The Americans and Russians had shaken hands at the Elbe, but none of it felt real behind the barbed wire and pine trees of Camp Ruston. For the women inside, time no longer moved forward. It circled. Morning roll calls, work assignments, evening lights out. What had once been a survival routine was now a limbo between worlds. It was then that the letters began. Not official correspondence. There were no stamps, no envelopes, no censors. Just pieces of paper folded into squares, hidden under pillows or pressed between books. They weren't meant to be sent. They were confessions. Annalisa wrote the first one. "Mama, I saw an American soldier give a child his sandwich. The child was German. He didn't speak, he just ate. And the soldier didn't even wait for thanks. Why did they tell us these men were animals? Why did we believe them? Forgive me for what I was. I didn't know what knowing meant." She didn't show it to anyone. She folded it tight and tucked it into her boot, as if the leather might absorb the shame. Soon, more women began to write. Some wrote to fathers who had died at Stalingrad. Others wrote to children they hadn't seen in years. Some wrote to themselves, to the younger versions of who they had been, begging them to see what now could not be unseen. Elfrida's letter was quiet and devastating. "To my students, I taught you order. I taught you duty. I never taught you doubt. I see now that doubt is not weakness. Doubt is the beginning of conscience. I failed you all." At night, the women read to each other in low voices, often with tears they tried to hide. The letters never ended with hope. They ended with questions, the kind that couldn't be answered inside a camp or even in a country. Did we choose wrong, or were we never given the chance to choose? That question echoed like a rifle shot across their silence. It was not guilt that consumed them. Guilt is for those who acted. It was complicity, obedience, silence. Things that had felt like virtue when screamed from loudspeakers and printed on banners. Now they felt like rot. One evening, a new group of prisoners arrived. Young German women taken in Belgium, captured with stacks of propaganda leaflets and radios. These newcomers were harder, eyes like flint, backs straight with pride. They laughed at the books, the music, the soap. "You've gone soft," one of them spat. "You sit here reading American fairy tales while our people starve." But their defiance didn't provoke anger, only weariness. Because the others had already passed through that stage, the brittle armor of belief before it cracked under kindness. Annalisa watched them eat in silence and whispered to Elfrida, "That was me, not long ago." Elfrida nodded. And it will be them. One day. Still, the tension was real. It turned the mess hall cold. It turned the work lines quiet. The two camps, those still clinging to the Reich and those who had let it slip from their hands, now shared the same cots. That night, Ilsa, the quietest among them, stood up after lights out and walked to the center of the barracks. Her voice trembled. Her German was slow, careful. "I had a brother," she said. "He died in Warsaw. I was told he was a hero. Now I think maybe he just died." No one moved, not even the newcomers. She continued, "I am tired of pretending. I am tired of being proud of silence." Then she sat down, and no one called her a traitor. The next morning, the guards distributed blank sheets of paper and envelopes. For the first time since their arrival, the women were allowed to send real letters home, censored, of course, and read by army officers. But still, a message beyond the wire. They lined up to write. Some stared at the paper for hours. Others wrote quickly, letting the ink carry what their voices never could. Elfrida's letter was addressed to no one. "We are not who we were. But we do not yet know who we are. We eat their bread. We read their books. We sleep in their beds. We do not know what they expect of us. But they expect nothing. That's what breaks us." The envelopes were collected, stacked, stamped, and taken away. Some would never arrive. But that wasn't the point. The act of writing was not about being heard. It was about finally listening to oneself. Later that week, a group of American chaplains entered the camp with a small record player. They played Beethoven. The same Beethoven that once thundered beneath Nazi rallies now echoed across the pine groves of a POW camp in Louisiana. Soft, slow, shattering, Ilsa cried quietly, pressing her hands over her ears. "I can't tell if I'm mourning or remembering," she whispered. The others didn't answer. Because in truth, they were all doing both. The sky above Camp Ruston had begun to change. Spring crept slowly into Louisiana's pines, not with fanfare, but with small, almost imperceptible signs. A warmer breeze, budding needles on the trees, the faint scent of rain before it fell. Inside the wire, change moved more slowly. Not in the rules, those stayed the same, but in the way the women walked. The stiffness had softened. The silences had gained color. Some now smiled cautiously. Some dared to hum as they swept the mess hall or folded linens in the laundry. But change always demands a mirror. And in Camp Ruston, that mirror arrived in the form of the others. The camp was large, and not just for women. Beyond the barbed fences, housed in separate quarters, were men, German soldiers, captured in Tunisia, Italy, and France. They worked the camp fields, built fences, hauled lumber, and occasionally passed within sight of the women's barracks. For months, the women had avoided looking. It felt improper, dangerous even. But over time, the distance between the genders became not just physical, but philosophical, because the men had not changed. Not in the same way. One afternoon, while scrubbing mess trays, Annalisa caught sight of a male POW leaning against a fence pole. He smoked a cigarette and laughed with his companion, cocky, careless, as if this were no more than a field exercise. His uniform was tattered, but his posture was tall. The women watched silently. Later, when the same man passed a guard and sneered, "The Reich will rise again," something in Annalisa cracked. "Does he not see?" she asked Elfrida that night. Elfrida folded her hands. "He sees what he wants to preserve. We are seeing what we must become." In those words lay the fracture, between those still clinging to pride and those beginning to grieve it. A week later, a mixed labor detail was organized. It was minor, carrying lumber from one shed to another. But for the first time, Women from the Ruston camp were assigned to work alongside men. It was awkward at first. Eyes averted, words few. But the American overseers said nothing, watched carefully, and let them proceed. Elfriede worked beside a man in his early 30s. Once an Oberfeldwebel, by the insignia barely clinging to his shirt. He asked if she had been with the Red Cross. She nodded. He nodded back. That was all. But then he said, "You shouldn't be here. Women shouldn't see defeat like this." Elfriede turned, surprised. "We saw it before you did. You just never looked." He chuckled bitterly. "And now you sit with them. Laugh with them." "No," she said. "I eat their bread. And it doesn't taste like betrayal. It tastes like truth." He said nothing more. But the silence between them pulsed with meaning. That evening, the women gathered in the sewing room. A quiet space where uniforms were mended, buttons replaced, blankets patched. It had become their sanctuary. There, conversations flowed more freely, without guards, without men. Marta, who rarely spoke of home, broke the silence. "My husband, he died on the Eastern Front, fighting for something he didn't believe in. But he never said it out loud. He died with the lie in his mouth." Ilsa answered gently. "We all did. Until someone gave us towels." They all knew what she meant. That first day, that bath, that moment when the war didn't end with a gunshot, but with hot water and soap. It had become their creation myth. The instant they stopped being prisoners of war and started becoming prisoners of truth. Weeks passed. The women learned more English. They laughed at their own accents, at their stumbles. One even translated a joke from Stars and Stripes, the American military paper, and made the others giggle. A quiet contest started. Who could say peanut butter without wincing? But even joy carried guilt. "I feel wrong," Annalisa said one night. "To be happy here, to be safe, when everything we knew has crumbled." Elfriede looked up from her journal. "Maybe what we knew was never whole. And now we're learning what it means to be broken and still live." They fell into silence again, each holding her own thought like a wound that was finally starting to close. One morning, a package arrived from a nearby town, donated clothing from American civilians. Civilian dresses, stockings, ribbons. The guards passed them out wordlessly, then left. The women stared at the pile. They hadn't worn civilian clothes since 1942. The thought of fabric not tied to duty or rank made their hands tremble. Marta picked up a pale blue dress and held it to her frame. It was too large. She smiled. "Perhaps I'll grow into it." That night, many of the women sat in their bunks, not in uniform, but in mismatched cotton, floral prints, checkered sleeves. They didn't look like prisoners. They looked like women again, and for the first time, a mirror was passed between them. Not one of polished glass, but of presence. They saw in each other not enemies, not ghosts of a fallen nation, but survivors, not of the war, but of what the war had turned them into. Spring bloomed fully in Louisiana by the time the first letter from home arrived. It came wrapped in layers of red tape, stamped 3 times by U.S. Army censors, and carried the stale scent of old paper. It was addressed to Ilsa. She held it like it might break. The handwriting was familiar, her younger sister's. But what mattered was what it contained. Recognition. Someone in the world still remembered her name, still knew she existed, beyond uniform, beyond nationality. She read the letter aloud in the barracks, her voice trembling. The town was bombed in March. We had no food for weeks. Mother lost her shop. They say the Americans are in Berlin. We hear they are kind. We hear they share bread with children. Silence followed. Then Annalisa whispered, "Even they are hearing it. Not just at Camp Ruston, but across the rubble of Germany. A new whisper was spreading. that mercy could come not with flags or fanfare, but in warm hands and unspoken gestures. The days turned golden, longer, softer, and with them came a strange new ritual. Each Sunday, the American chaplain set out a folding table near the edge of the barracks yard. Upon it, he placed books, hymnals, and a small wooden cross. Nothing grand, nothing ornate. He said no sermons. He simply waited. Some women passed without a glance, but others began to stop, to read, to ask questions. And then, one by one, they sat, not to convert, not to confess, but to listen, to the possibility of something bigger than what they had been taught. Annalisa sat through one full reading, the parable of the prodigal son. She didn't blink through the final line. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. She closed the book. No one spoke, because something in the parable had spoken for them all. One afternoon, a young American lieutenant walked the length of the women's compound, stopping to inspect the vegetable plots. His name was Lieutenant James Holloway, barely 25. Soft-spoken, son of a preacher from Mississippi. He spoke German haltingly, but with effort. He asked questions, listened. He pointed to the tomato vines. Who planted these? Marta raised her hand. They grow better if you talk to them. He laughed gently. That's what my mother says. Then, unexpectedly, he squatted beside the plants and helped clear a patch of weeds. An officer, in the dirt, beside a prisoner. No one had ever seen such a thing. When he stood, he brushed soil from his trousers, nodded once, and walked away. Later, Marta turned to the others and said, "He reminded me of my brother, before the war." For hours, she sat quietly. And then came the news. Germany had surrendered. It arrived not with trumpets, but in the dull, clean voice of a translator reading from a typed sheet at morning roll call. As of May 7, 1945, all German forces have capitulated. The Reich is no more. No one cheered, no one wept. They stood motionless in the humid Louisiana air, the pine trees swaying gently above them, as if nodding to something they could not yet name. The guards did not smile. The women did not collapse. There was no celebration, only stillness, a silence so deep it was sacred. Later that night, Elfrida wrote in her journal, "The war ended, but no bells rang, no flags fell, just silence." And the long walk back to ourselves began. In the days that followed, small changes unfolded. The guards relaxed, rules softened, but most importantly, something unspoken passed between prisoner and captor. They had shared time, weather, labor, food, and that sharing had changed them. One day, a shipment of donated shoes arrived, civilian, worn but clean. Women bent to try them on. Laughter came, not bitter, not mocking, but full. Marta slipped into a pair of red flats that didn't match anything she wore. "They're ugly," she said. "But they don't march," Annalisa replied. Everyone laughed. And someone began to hum again, the same lullaby that had once cracked the air on their first night in Ruston. Then came the visits. Civilians, teachers, pastors, even local farm wives, began stopping by the outer gates. They spoke with the American staff. Some offered bread, others offered books. One woman simply passed a bundle of handkerchiefs through the fence. "To remind them of softness," she said. One by one, the walls that war had built began to dissolve, not with politics, but with presence, with the refusal to hate, even when hate was earned. In the sewing room, the women began to stitch small flags, not national ones, not emblems of victory or identity, but small, hand-dyed squares embroidered with flowers, birds, suns, and rivers. Annalisa stitched a pine tree, its roots twisted deep. Elfrida stitched a circle of open hands. Ilse stitched the outline of a woman bathing, head bowed, surrounded by steam. They hung the flags in the barracks, quiet and proud. Not to claim a nation, but to remember mercy. And in the fading light, when the wind stirred the fabric, it sounded like breath. The breath of women who had once feared water, and now understood it could cleanse without drowning. The day the transport list was posted, no one cheered. A sheet of paper, tacked to the mess hall bulletin board, listed 40 names. Underneath it, a date. Scheduled for repatriation, June 14th. They had been waiting for this moment for months, dreaming of it, praying for it. But when it came, it didn't feel like liberation. It felt like standing on a dock, staring at the ocean, unsure whether the shore on the other side was still real. Annalisa found her name first. Her eyes scanned the page 3 times, as if it might vanish if she blinked. She turned to Elfrida. "I don't know where I'm going back to." Elfrida nodded. "Nor do I." Her name was not on the list. That afternoon, the women who would leave were separated. They were given new instructions, what they could take, what they had to leave behind. Uniforms were exchanged for plain gray skirts and white blouses. Their hair was trimmed neatly. Red Cross kits were prepared, but no one packed quickly. No one celebrated. Instead, there was a hush, a kind of reverence for what they were leaving, not the barbed wire, not the beds or guards, but what had been shed here. The burden of certainty, the illusion of pride, the silence that protected guilt. Ilse stood before her bunk for a full hour before placing a folded towel into her satchel. "This isn't just cloth," she whispered. "It's proof." That evening, the chaplain returned. Not with a sermon, not even with his Bible. He brought a stack of blank cards and a pen. "Write something," he said. "Not to your country, not even to your family. Write to the person you want to become." At first, no one moved. Then Marta sat. Then Annalisa. Then one by one, others followed. On the cards, they didn't write about countries. They wrote about people. "I want to remember how it felt to be given bread without asking. I want to be the kind of woman who teaches her daughter to listen first. I want to remember the name of the black soldier who helped me carry water. Not because he had to, but because he saw I was tired." By nightfall, the cards were pinned on a wall, like silent prayers. They flapped gently in the breeze. A chapel made of memory. The morning of June 14th arrived with thick clouds. Humidity clung to every surface. The pine trees sagged under the weight of the coming rain. The women gathered by the trucks in silence, each holding her Red Cross bag, each dressed in borrowed dignity. They did not salute. They did not sing. They simply turned to those who remained, the ones not yet called home, and embraced them, one by one. Quietly, Ilse hugged Elfrida last. "Will we recognize each other?" Elfrida touched her cheek. "We already do." The truck started. Gravel crunched beneath the tires. As the convoy moved past the gate, one woman turned to look back. Not at the fence, but at the laundry line behind the barracks, still strung with faded dresses, cotton shirts, and the tiny stitched flags they had made. The wind picked up, and one of the flags, Annalisa's pine tree, fluttered hard against the wire, but did not fall. The journey back across the Atlantic would be long. The country they were returning to was not the one they had left. Cities flattened, fathers dead, governments gone. But worse, or better, was that they were not the same women. No longer messengers of a collapsing empire. No longer carriers of blind belief. They were now witnesses, not of allied power, but of something harder to define. A kind of mercy that did not demand surrender, only presence. Back at Camp Ruston, the women who remained gathered their chores quietly. The sewing room felt emptier, the mess line quieter. But in place of absence came reflection. Elfrida wrote in her journal, "They have gone. But I am not sad. I am filled. This place gave us no promises, only water, bread, and space to become. We arrived as prisoners of war. We stayed as prisoners of ourselves. And now, some of us leave as something new, not cleansed, but seen." That night, the chaplain left behind a note. When a fire passes through a forest, it does not leave silence. It leaves the conditions for something else to grow. It was tacked gently to the door of the barracks, and under it, someone added a line in German pencil. "Wir haben nicht vergessen. Wir haben gelernt." We did not forget. We learned. The sky broke open with rain, not a storm, but a warm summer downpour. The women stood under the eaves, watching as the water turned the dirt to steam, the dust to smell, the past to vapor. And somewhere in the rain, between the earth and the thunder, they felt forgiven, not by their country, not by their captors, but by something older than both, by the simple act of surviving what should have broken them, and choosing somehow to still be whole. When the trucks disappeared down the gravel road and the dust settled behind them, the camp felt different, not emptier, but quieter in a way that clung to the skin. It wasn't just the missing faces. It was the absence of something that had slowly grown among the women. A shared rhythm, an invisible bond forged not in ideology, but in rituals of survival and grace. Now that rhythm had been broken. The remaining women, about 45, resumed their duties. They cleaned latrines, peeled potatoes, folded uniforms, hung wet sheets. But every motion now carried something heavier. The knowledge that they were still waiting, still not called, still not home. Elfrida, always the quiet compass of the group, noticed the change first. She wrote in her journal, "The ones who stayed feel the weight of staying, and the ones who left carry the burden of going." Perhaps that is the price of mercy, to hold its memory without knowing when it will return. The sewing room, once alive with low conversation and careful stitching, now echoed with silence. Only the click of needles, only the brush of fabric. Ilsa no longer sang. Marta no longer joked about peanut butter or shoes. Annalisa had left, and with her had gone the laughter that once broke the long afternoons. Still, they stitched. They stitched as if each seam held the hope that they might be called next. Each night they folded their civilian clothes again, ready in case the list came, and each morning they unfolded them, waiting. Waiting became its own kind of imprisonment, not of walls or fences, but of not knowing when one would be free. But in that limbo, something else began to bloom, a ritual of memory. The women who remained began to gather every Sunday, not because they were told, but because it felt right. No guards, no commands. Just a circle, just words. They took turns reading from the cards left behind, the ones pinned on the wall weeks before. I want to raise my son without flags. I want to remember the hands that gave me bread, not the hands that raised a fist. I want to believe that mercy is not weakness, but strength we never understood. They read them like scripture, not from a pulpit, but from the floor, legs crossed, heads bowed. Afterward, they would sit in silence. And in that silence, they began to sew again. Not clothes, not patches, but symbols, little squares of linen, each one bearing a shape, a word, a color. They stitched tears, leaves, open palms. They stitched rivers and birds with broken wings. They called them flickers, flickers of what they had become, flickers of what might still return. They strung them together like garlands and hung them along the fence line, a silent choir of cloth and color whispering to the wind. We were here, We changed. We still wait. One afternoon, a new officer arrived at Camp Ruston. Major William H. Prescott, a stern man with spectacles and silver hair, recently transferred from a German POW camp in Texas. He walked the perimeter, reviewed the guards, inspected the barracks. When he entered the sewing room, he paused at the flickers. "These yours?" he asked. Ilsa stood. "They are ours," she said. Her voice steady, but soft. He examined them, silent. Then nodded once. "Keep them neat," he said, and left. That was all. But it was enough, because in that moment, they realized something vital. Even in a place built for control, some things could not be ordered, and therefore, they could not be taken. A week later, a Red Cross truck arrived unexpectedly. Inside were packages, not military issue, not official aid. They were from the women who had left. One box came from Annalise. Inside, a bar of soap, a hand-drawn sketch of Camp Ruston's pine trees, and a note. "I wake in the night, hearing the Louisiana rain. I am home, but I am not whole, because part of me still sits with you, in the sewing room, by the flickers. You taught me how to mourn gently, and I will carry that forever." Another box held dresses, another books, another just bread, stale but wrapped in cloth. Elfrida pressed it to her chest as if it were gold. She wrote no journal entry that night. She simply sat, holding the bread, as tears fell silently down her cheeks. The next day, the list came. 10 names. Elfrida's was not among them, but Ilsa's was. So was Marta's. The farewells were quieter this time. No ceremonies, no promises. Just eyes meeting across old beds. Just hands brushing shoulders. Ilsa left behind her flickers. "I want them to keep singing," she said, and Elfrida whispered, "They will." That night, after the gates closed behind the truck, Elfrida walked the perimeter of the women's compound. The pine trees were in full bloom now. The night was warm. Fireflies blinked across the grass like little witnesses. She stopped beside the fence, where the garland of flickers stirred in the breeze. She touched one, a river with no banks, and she said aloud, though no one was near, "I will stay until the last one leaves. And then I will walk away barefoot, carrying nothing but the memory of clean water and an unbroken voice." Then she turned back toward the barracks, and the flickers whispered behind her like wind through a chapel made of thread. By late summer, the camp was nearly empty. Of the hundreds who had once passed through the gates of Camp Ruston, only a handful remained. The long rows of bunks now echoed with footsteps instead of laughter. Barracks that once held stories in every corner stood silent, dust gathering on the windowsills. Sunlight stretching across the floor like threads of time, trying to stitch the past into stillness. Elfrida remained, not by punishment, not by accident, but by fate, it seemed. The others had gone. Annalisa, Ilsa, Marta, even the sharp-tongued newcomers who once mocked everything gentle. But she stayed. She swept the sewing room each morning, though no one stitched beside her. She watered the tomato vines, even though no one picked them. She visited the fence where the flickers still danced, faded now by sun and wind, their colors blurred, but their meanings still sharp. One morning in early September, a new name appeared on the transport list. Hers, printed in neat type. A simple entry. Bauer, Elfrida. Repatriation scheduled September 17th. No trumpets, no ceremony. She stared at it for a long time. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply turned and walked to her bunk. Inside, she opened her journal, the same one she had carried since the first days behind wire, and wrote, "The last bath I took in Germany was in silence. No towel, no warmth, only fear and the grit of retreat. Here, I was given water not to scrub me clean, but to remind me I was human. I leave not with my pride, but with my reflection. I know now what it means to be seen. The next few days passed like a closing ritual. She packed slowly, not because she had much, but because every object held weight. The comb she once shared with Ilsa, a torn page of leaves of grass gifted by Annalisa, the faded sketch of the pine trees, the ones that had stood silently through every transformation. She removed her flicker from the garland, a simple design, an open eye surrounded by stars. She held it for a long time, then folded it neatly, tucking it into the breast pocket of her blouse just over her heart. On her final morning, she walked the compound alone. The guards nodded respectfully. They had known her for over a year, not as an enemy, but as a presence, a stillness that held weight, a teacher without a classroom. At the sewing room, she sat one last time, no needle in her hand, just memory. She closed her eyes and let the silence speak to her. She saw the first bath. She saw women shaking with fear. She saw laughter rising over peanut butter and warm biscuits. She saw letters folded in trembling hands, never meant to be mailed. She saw women who had learned how to cry again and how to forgive themselves for not knowing better. And she saw herself, not as a prisoner, not as a patriot, but as a woman who had passed through war, not untouched, but unhardened. When the truck arrived, she was already at the gate. No bag, just her journal and the flicker in her pocket. Major Prescott approached. He extended his hand. "Miss Bauer," he said, "you've left quite a mark here." She shook his hand, then looked him in the eye. "I didn't leave the mark," she said softly. "The water did." He hesitated, then smiled. "I hope they welcome you home." She didn't answer, because she didn't know where home was anymore. The truck rolled forward. As the barbed gate swung open, Elfrida looked back one last time. The pine trees shimmered in the heat. The flickers along the fence rippled like silent hymns. And above it all, the sewing room, the mess hall, the showers, stood like quiet witnesses to something larger than punishment or politics. They stood as monuments to transformation. And as the truck passed through the gate, Elfrida placed her hand gently over her chest, feeling the flicker beneath her blouse like a second heartbeat. That night, long after she was gone, the wind returned. It swept through the empty compound, whispering across the dirt, the fences, the wooden slats. It lifted the edges of the last flickers, and though most were faded, one held firm Annalisa's pine tree, stitched with thick, stubborn thread. It trembled once, then stilled, not in mourning, but in peace. Years later, the barracks would be torn down, the fences would rust, the roads would crack, and Camp Ruston would fade into memory. But among the papers left behind, yellowed, fragile, was a torn page from a journal, unsigned. They gave us towels, they gave us soap, but most of all, they gave us back our faces, not the ones shaped by uniforms, the ones shaped by mercy. And so ends the story of Camp Ruston's women, not with fire, not with fury, but with water, and with the choice to begin again.